Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing well. So today I am back to talk about the books that I read in the second half of May. The end of May has been a surprisingly productive time for reading. I'm quite proud of myself. And between physical and audiobooks, I managed to finish off 10 books in the second half of this month, so don't know how I did that. So I think I will just go generally in terms of the order that I finished these books. So first off, we have The Revolt by Clara Dupont-Monod. This was a short little translated fiction, translated from the French, which tells the life of Eleanor of Aquitaine, but from the perspective of Richard the Lionheart, who was her son. This was a book that I found in a charity shop and picked up after not hearing anything about it, but just thinking the concept was really interesting. And I feel like whilst I found it an interesting concept, an interesting idea, I didn't fully enjoy it. This book honestly just reads like Richard the Lionheart's therapy session rather than an actual narrative. And I don't know, you tell me, that might be the point. And I guess my major criticism of this is that you don't really get fully formed personalities that feel very real. You just kind of get impressions of people, particularly Richard's own impressions of the people that he interacts with. And I think maybe you could make the argument that all of the characters seem very detached in terms of their personality because their relationships to each other are very detached. You definitely get the sense that this is not a very close-knit family, and that really shows. It's also a piece of historical fiction where I really do feel like you would need to do a little bit of homework before you read it. You would really want to know about the life of Eleanor of Aquitaine before you read this, because this narrative does not try to explain anything to you. It does definitely feel like you are meant to know things before you go in. You're meant to catch all of the references, which, you know, thankfully I did, but I think for a first-time reader would not be very approachable. Another thing that I didn't love about this book was that partway through it actually switches perspectives. It goes from being told from Richard's perspective to being Eleanor herself. And to be honest, I didn't really like that. I felt like a lot of the interest and the intrigue of this book lay in the fact that Richard could never really get a sense of his mother. And because of that, we as readers don't really get a true sense of her. There's a lot of mystery surrounding her. But then you very quickly and sharply switch into it being from her perspective, and then you lose all of that mystery. And it really didn't feel like narratively having her perspective added anything. No questions that we had left over from Richard's perspective were being answered. She wasn't really revealing anything that we'd had questions about. She's just kind of talking about things that are happening to her as they're happening. And yeah, I just felt like that was a bit of a mistake on the author's part. You just end up losing a lot of allure and mystery. So it is one that I'm definitely glad that I've read. I think if you are looking for fiction about this time period, then I would recommend it, but it wouldn't be a personal favourite for me. One of the books that I'm not going to talk too much about is Chaucer, A European Life by Marion. This, as you can see, was a very chunky biography of the life of Geoffrey Chaucer. So recounting his life, but particularly chronicling his relationship to Europe, his relationship to his travels and the different courts that he spent times in, and particularly how they influenced his writing. This is a book that I read on my own free time that is published by the publisher that I work for, so I am not going to delve too much in aside from telling you what it is about and giving a description. I hope that's all right with you and maybe piqued your interest on this book. Moving swiftly on to this. Yeah, during the month I found this little collection of Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats by T.S. Elliot, which, if you couldn't tell from my beautiful rendition of the theme song, is the poetry collection that inspired Andrew Lloyd Webber to write the musical Cats. And yeah, if you've ever read these, you can definitely see that he didn't just take inspiration. Pretty much like verbatim, some of these poems are lifted and taken into the song lyrics, which, because I know the musical already, made it quite a breeze to read, because I feel like Andrew Lloyd Webber had already done a lot of the hard work for me in riddling out like the rhythm of these poems. It's a really fun, slightly bizarre little poetry collection. Definitely one that you would want to read with children. I don't know if I would recommend it much further beyond like musical theatre fans and children, but it is fun. I am glad that I've read it. The next book that I read was Swan Song by Kelleigh Greenberg-Jephcott. I still cannot get that to roll off the tongue. This is another piece of historical fiction chronicling the life of the author Truman Capote, his relationship to a set of female friends, and particularly the blow-up that happened in his relationship to these women after he published an article for Esquire magazine where he basically broadcasted a lot of their very intimate personal stories, and that sharp feeling of betrayal that a lot of these women felt, feeling like their friendships had been manipulated and just used to advance Truman's career. This was a really interesting read to me. In terms of the level of research that this author did into this time period, it's kind of like on Wolf Hall levels of immersion and research. I was very, very impressed with that. However, in terms of the actual writing and the way that this story is told, I feel like, I don't know how to explain, it's kind of like the stories are more interesting and more compelling themselves than the way that it's told. Whilst I was reading this, I did find myself at times getting a little bit frustrated and not bored, but I wasn't being really pulled into the story. And I think part of that is because I could never 100% get a grip on all of the characters, and especially the women, the swans. They could often blend into each other if you didn't already know who these figures were, some of whom I had already heard of and had knowledge about, and some of which I didn't. However, when I kind of pulled back and I stopped reading this book, when I recalled the different stories, I found myself intrigued and thinking, oh yes, let's go back to this. But then once again, I opened the book and then the actual telling, the writing didn't pull me in. I don't know if that made sense. One thing that I will say about this is that I would really highly recommend giving the audiobook a listen, especially if you don't already know these figures and the history surrounding them. I think it really brings these characters to life, especially Truman Capote, who we know had a very, very distinctive voice, which I feel like if you didn't already know that would really get lost in this book. So yeah, definitely an interesting one and a very, very accomplished book. I would recommend reading it if you are interested in this time period, if you are interested in this like glamorous 60s, 70s, if you're interested in like New York society in that time period. And I'd probably say one to pick up if you're a fan of something like The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. If you're a fan of Breakfast at Tiffany's and Truman Capote, you want to learn more about his life, then yeah, give it a read. And then the next book that I read was The Uncommon Reader by Alan Bennett. This was such a fun little book. This is just a little short novella all about the idea of the Queen of England, though it is definitely a fictionalized version of the Queen of England, stumbling across a library in the palace and picking up a couple of books from there and then becoming suddenly obsessed with reading, and how her new obsession with reading really takes a toll on her doing her queenly duties. And you're slowly but surely seeing as all of the palace staff and all of the public become increasingly frustrated with her for not doing her job because she's just too obsessed with books, and she doesn't seem to understand that barely anybody else has the same level of passion and commitment to reading that she does. There's even a comment in here from one of her aides being like, yeah, the British public just don't read. This was definitely one of those short but pack a punch kind of books. It's very satirical. It's so incredibly funny. There were so many times when I was like laughing out loud reading this, and I was enjoying reading this so much that like I was reading it on the bus, I got off the bus and I just kept on reading as I walked to my house. I very, very rarely get a book out to read whilst I'm walking, so that's a sign. But maybe it's also because it's so portable, just a little ditty thing. If you are just wanting something short, sweet and funny, then definitely give this a go. If you're wanting a book that is about the joy of reading, definitely one that I highly recommend. I would say aside from the books that I either reread or re-listened to, this was definitely my favourite thing that I read this month. I've started making a start on my reread or re-listen to the 6 novels of Jane Austen. This is something that I've been wanting to do ahead of Jane Austen July because I'm really keen to make a ranking video kind of talking about how I would rank all of the 6 major novels of Jane Austen. I do already have like my order in my head of what I think my favourite Jane Austen novels are, but I felt like it's been a few years since I've read some of them. I think Sense and Sensibility I read in 2016 for the first time and then have never read it since. So I felt it was only fair to kind of read them back to back and yeah, get a gauge on where I stand with these books now. And for this little project that I've set myself, I listened to Emma, and I shan't say too much about Emma now because I have spoken about it in, I think it was my April 2020 wrap up, so I'll link that down below, but also I am going to mention it in my Jane Austen video. But Emma's always good fun. And then I went on a bit of a kick of listening to Madeline Miller books. Of course, I went to The Song of Achilles, which is one of my favourite books of all time, always gives me so much comfort and joy. I say joy, I also mean tears. Song of Achilles, of course, being a retelling of the Trojan War, but particularly from the perspective of Patroclus and Achilles, and having the narrative be that Patroclus and Achilles were in fact lovers, not just friends, and definitely not just cousins as the Troy movie depicted them. And yeah, it got me emotional again. It made me cry at the end. I just really like this book, guys. And like I say, because I enjoyed my re-listen of Song of Achilles so much, it really prompted me to look out an audiobook for Circe, also by Madeline Miller, which is one that I've only read the one time, and I read it back in October 2019. And it was another book like with Song of Achilles where the first time I read it, I thought, yeah, this is okay, this is good. This is a very competent novel, but it didn't really grab me. And I think part of that is because Circe especially was one of the very first pieces of like Greek myth retelling that I ever read. And I think, truth be told, I wasn't really that up on my Greek myths as I should have been. And I think since then I have read so many Greek myth retellings that I knew that I had to go back to Circe and just kind of reassess what I think of it. I recently listened to a podcast episode that my friend Sadie, who you might have previously known as the Lit Ghost on YouTube, she did a few videos but she's not posting anymore, but it's okay because she is posting her podcast with her sister, the podcast being Lit and Libations, and it's very, very good. I think one of the very first podcast episodes that she ever did with her sister was on Circe, and they went through the entire story, and I found myself almost crying in the supermarket whilst I was listening to it because it was affecting me so much. And I remember the book did not have that effect on me the first time that I read it, so I had to go back to it. And yeah, I would definitely say, since having learned a bit more about the Greek myths and kind of fitting Circe into those stories, I really, really enjoyed it this time round. I don't think it hits quite the same heights that the Song of Achilles did, but really, really enjoyable, and it definitely marks Madeline Miller as one of my favourite authors. And it really honestly breaks my heart that she has said that she's not going to be doing any more Greek myth retellings because she's just so good at it. I mean, to be fair, I will read anything else that she does because I think she's a fantastic writer, but it seems a shame. One book that I'm not going to delve too much into my thoughts on now because I am going to do its own like full book review is the Dictionary of Lost Words by Pip Williams. This is historical fiction. It's set at the turn of the 20th century. Most of the narrative is kind of between the 1880s to the 1910s. We are basically following the life of Esme Nicol, who lives in Oxford in the late 19th, early 20th century, and whose father works on the Oxford English Dictionary, basically compiling all of the different words together and trying to evaluate and assess which words should deserve to be in the Oxford English Dictionary. However, through the course of the book, Esme notices that she has a pull towards words that seem to be neglected by scholars. Words that are frequently used, particularly slang words that are particularly used by society, but which have never been written down and therefore not deemed to be important words. Words that are very gendered, words that are very class-based. I think that's a pass for me. Like I say, I am planning on doing a full review of this with more details. And because Oxford itself plays such a role, such a character in this book, Pip Williams is constantly referencing different places in Oxford, different street names, which are street names that I'm getting more and more familiar with. And she even includes a lovely, helpful little map here of the different key places within the book. I actually went on a nice long walk around Oxford yesterday, and I just got my phone camera out and started filming around these different places. And I don't know, I just thought that would be quite nice. And as always, let's have a moment for the beautiful, beautiful cover and the gorgeous, gorgeous end papers that really helped to tell the story. It's a book that I really enjoyed, and I now feel like I've got a very personal connection to it because of the connection to Oxford. And then finally, I think maybe I've put this book off till last because it's the book that I liked the least so far this month. And it is one that potentially people are going to be a bit cross with me for not liking because it's a very popular historical fiction. So I didn't really like The Familiars by Stacey Halls. Okay. So, like I said, The Familiars by Stacey Halls is historical fiction. It is taking place in the 17th century in Lancashire. We are following the story of 17-year-old Fleetwood Shuttleworth, who I keep on wanting to refer to as Fleetwood Shuttlecock. And even though she's only 17 years old, she has been married for quite a few years to a man who... I don't think we ever find out how old her husband Richard is, but they have been married for a few years and she is already on her 4th pregnancy. However, her previous 3 ended in miscarriages and stillbirths. And she found out from a letter from the doctor to her husband that it is most likely that if she has another baby, if they try to get her pregnant again, she will probably die in the attempt to give birth. Fleetwood is suffering from stress and pressure from different sides of her family to have a healthy heir to the throne. And that is what they refer to the child as throughout the book. I need to make an heir. Aren't you sad that you're not going to have an heir? We'll have an heir before Christmas. She's feeling very, very anxious about this and ends up randomly one day stumbling across a woman in the woods who she finds out is a midwife and decides out of nowhere to have this woman be the midwife to her child, even though she doesn't know anything about her. But because she can sense that she is like this wise woman who will definitely help her get her child to full term. However, it is the early 17th century and James I is on witch hunt. And through the course of the story, this mysterious woman, Alice Gray, that she has hired to be her midwife, ends up being accused of witchcraft. So of course Fleetwood is trying to prove that this is not the case, not only because she is currently pregnant and she needs Alice to get her through to full term because otherwise they may both die, she's also started to befriend this woman and she doesn't want her to die. And I feel like if you've watched my videos before, you might have guessed that the reason that I didn't like it is because it does employ this witchy wise woman trope, which I've spoken about previously that I have issues with. However, it was not that at all that detracted me from this book. I just could not stand how Stacey Halls wrote this period and wrote this story. So this book is... how many pages is it? So the main story of this book takes over about 418 pages. Honestly, you could have taken out about this much if you just cut out all of the unnecessarily bit of historical padding that Stacey Hall's added to the story. She includes so many extraneous details that you do not need, just to kind of prove to you, the reader, that yes, I am Stacey Hall and I have done my homework. I know I've done so much research into this time period, and let me show you on the page how much historical research I've put into this, even though it adds no bearing to the story at all. I know I've mentioned this before, but it is something that really frustrates me with historical fiction, is that authors feel like they need to tell you everything, and they just don't. And honestly, when I started reading this, I genuinely, I felt the urge to get my camera out and just kind of read through this and add my own commentary to all of it. But I very quickly realized that would be a little bit mean and not necessary, and it's not what I want my channel to be about. I just found the writing really clunky and awkward. She added so many details that did not need to be there and did not evoke like the atmosphere at all. It was literally just her trying to show that she's smart and that she's done her research. I don't think it's necessary. And another gripe that I had with this is that the author seems to have a real fascination with trying to show gore and blood, and it kind of felt manipulative. It felt like it was there to shock people. Something I would say if you are thinking about reading this is that if you do not feel comfortable reading passages where blood is described, if you do not feel comfortable reading about miscarriages and stillbirths, then I would give this a wide berth. Didn't really mean to do that, but there it is. Because Stacey Hall's does go into like quite graphic detail about Fleetwood's miscarriages, and the discussion on it will often pop up in places that you don't expect. Felt to me like it was kind of gratuitous and just there to shock, rather than adding like a commentary on her state of mind, of how these miscarriages have affected her emotionally. There is a moment where Fleetwood's husband Richard is pouring wine, and he's pouring wine to give to Fleetwood's mother, and out of nowhere Fleetwood would just describe it and she'd be like, ah, the wine was ruby red, kind of like the miscarriages that I had. And I was like, was there a need for that? I can completely understand the argument that, you know, when you've had that traumatic experience, that maybe you can just see it everywhere. But that's not what this felt like to me. It just felt like it was there to shock. And it was so repetitive, and it was also used in conjunction with animal deaths, which would be referenced frequently. The first time that we ever meet Alice Gray, she is holding 2 dead rabbits. And this author is just obsessed with detailing these dead rabbits and how the blood is trickling down her fingers. And like I say, it just feels gratuitous. It doesn't seem like it is there for any sort of function. I don't feel like these darker themes are explored in a very graceful, skillful way. It just feels like this book is trying to be super edgy and shocking. I didn't enjoy decisions that characters made. I wasn't pulled to any of them. Even the friendship between Fleetwood and Alice just seemed really arbitrary. Not for me. So yes, those were all of the books that I have read in the second half of May. Clearly, I need to finish less books because my throat is very dry and I need water now. Do let me know if you have read any of the books that I've spoken about today, and also do let me know about any books that you finished off in the second half of May. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.